the association as soon as they selected me. But luckily, I had a wonderful chairwoman, who was a local councillor, a fantastic woman called Liz Walker. And she stamped on any of that sort of prejudice, as she put it. And it's thanks to her, I think, that I got the nomination. But I didn't find there was any... I mean, in most of my selection meetings, I really didn't feel it in the room at all. But that was by 2010. I guess when you and I were looking in 03, 04, perhaps that couldn't be said, no. I think there was still a lingering prejudice among too many people, really.
Did you always know that you were different as a child?
Not as a... Well, to be honest... I had a horrible feeling that dawned upon me during my adolescence that things were not going to plan. And in that way, it wasn't something I realised at a very young age at all. But I think possibly it's easier for girls to overlook in a sense, because certainly at girls' boarding schools there was this kind of culture of having a crush on an older girl, and that was considered completely normal. So for quite a long time, I felt, that, the women or the girls that I fell for, this was just a normal part of growing up. The fact that it continued to the age of 14 was probably a clue. But still, I didn't really realise. And then I started to worry about it. And it wasn't until I got to university and I met a girl on my first night at Freshers who was General Secretary of the Students' Union, President of the Students' Union in every other university. And she was an amazing woman at the time, and she was wearing a badge which said in large red letters, "Every woman can be a lesbian." And I was utterly horrified that anyone should be walking around with such a statement. I couldn't believe my eyes. I was totally freaked out by it, because I'd spent several years denying this, worrying about it, etc. Anyway, she became my first girlfriend. And we were together throughout our university time and a few years on from that, and we're still good friends to this day.
And that was Margot James, and you can hear the whole hour-long interview on the Iain Dale All Talk podcast. Well, after 9, it's the LBC Business Hour, but coming up next, it's LBC's weekly political panel debate show, Cross Question. Your chance to quiz our panel on the big issues of the week, and let's face it, there are plenty of them. The lines are open now, the cameras are about to be switched on. You can watch us on Global Player or LBC's YouTube, Facebook and Twitter channels. Joining me for the next hour are Business Minister Paul Scully, Shadow Health Minister Justin Madders, left-wing commentator Ash Sarkar and right-wing commentator Mahyar Tousi. Phone in with your question on 0345 6060 973. I'll see you the other side of the LBC News.
On your radio, on Global Player and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, pubs, restaurants and cafes are to be banned from selling alcohol indoors in Scotland to help reduce the number of cases. It'll remain that way for more than 2 weeks starting Friday night. The country's recorded more than 1,000 new COVID cases in 24 hours for the first time. The government's put together a special task force to develop ways to cut the travel quarantine period in the UK. It'll look to see if coronavirus testing is possible. 2 suspected terrorists from London accused of being part of an Islamic State cell are appearing in court in the US. Alexander Cote and El Shafei El Sheikh allegedly belong to a group in Syria known as the Beatles because of their British accents. American journalist James Foley was killed in 2014. His mother Diane hopes they'll cooperate.
Hopefully these men will implicate others and give us information about where the remains of our children are.
The former Minneapolis police officer charged with murdering George Floyd has been released from prison after posting $1 million bail. Derek Chauvin's charged with second-degree murder related to the death in custody back in May. And nearly 900 jobs are at risk at Manchester, Stansted and East Midlands airports because of the impact of the pandemic. The FTSE 100 has closed down 3 points at 59.46. The pound buys $1.29 and €1.09. LBC weather: rain in the southwest, Wales, Northern Ireland, southern Scotland and the north of England. A low of 6 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Serena Farrow.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, good evening and welcome to Cross Question, LBC's weekly political panel debate show. We'll be here in LBC's Westminster studio each Wednesday at 8 p.m. on the dot to answer questions from LBC listeners. And as well as listening to us on the radio, you can watch us on Global Player and on LBC's YouTube, Facebook and Twitter feeds. If you'd like to take part in the show and ask our panel a question, all you have to do is pick up the phone and dial 0345 6060 973. The lines are open now. All previous episodes of the programme are on the Cross Question podcast, and this show will appear there before midnight. Well, it's time to introduce our panel. In the studio with me and socially distanced are the Conservative MP and Business Minister Paul Scully, Labour MP, Shadow Health Minister Justin Madders, both regulars on the show. Joining me from our Leicester Square studio is Novara Media's Ash Sarkar, and via Skype it's political YouTuber Mahyar Tousi. Welcome to you all. Let's go to our first question, and it is from Karen, who's in Putney. Karen, what's your question, please?
Hello, Iain and the panel.
Hi.
My question is, how should the coronavirus debt be paid off?
Now, that's a very big question. Ash Sarkar, let's come to you first.
So the one thing that I would say about government debt is that it's not quite like household debt. There's control over what period of time it gets paid back. So, for instance, paying back the reparations to former slave owners only got paid off in the last decade. People simply didn't notice. So it can be done incredibly slowly. What I think needs to happen is, rather than returning to the failed policies of austerity, which some studies have suggested took £100 billion out of the economy, is that the government uses this as an opportunity to be brave, to stimulate green industries, to protect people's jobs, and to make society on the whole a lot fairer. Rather than trying to balance the books on the backs of the poor, you actually use government money wisely to invest in people's futures.
Don't the books have to be balanced in the end, though? You can't consistently, over decades, maybe even centuries, keep running up budget deficits.
Well, the idea is that you spend government money wisely in such a way that it actually grows the economy. It increases people's spending power and it therefore increases the tax intake. So I'm not just saying, embark on splashing around the cash willy-nilly corporate welfare, which does nothing to, increase the spending power of ordinary people. What you do is you look towards the challenges that this country faces in the future and the present as well, in terms of, supporting the care system, making sure we've got a fully functioning care system, a transition towards a green economy. This is something which Boris Johnson himself has been talking about, and I'm glad that he is. And you use that money to grow jobs in those industries.
You said something nice about Boris Johnson. I've never heard that before.
I know, I'm going to wash my mouth out.
Paul Scully, there is an inherent conflict here, isn't there? Because Rishi Sunak said this week that Conservative governments want to balance the books, and he wants to do that now. And yet Boris Johnson has ruled out going back to austerity. It's kind of got to be one or the other, hasn't it?
No, it can be a mix. I think, when Ash is talking about, austerity and balancing the books of the poor and things like that, it's the 10-year argument, the 10-year-old argument, looking at the last recession rather than this recession. As you say, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, they said that, look, they're not going to embark on anything that looks like austerity 2.0, but we're going to have to be careful about what we spend. We're going to have to be careful on how we balance the books fiscally, in terms of because you don't just put taxes up willy-nilly, because often that means that you get less cash in the Treasury as a result, if it proves a disincentive.
But do you
for
accept that
business and job
taxes
creation.
will have to go up at some point, even if it's not in the next year or two, because that would kill a recovery? At some point, we are all going to have to get used to paying more tax.
Well, I think it's one of the reasons that the Chancellor's postponed the budget, because we're still going through the process of actually working out the support that we've got at the moment. We've spent £190 billion worth of instant support through the loans, through the furlough system, through the self-employed system, and now we've got the job retention bonus coming in, and Kickstarter and apprenticeship. So there's still a lot of spending going on at the moment to prompt that economic recovery, to prompt the sort of green recovery that Ash was talking about. So it is going to be a suite of measures that we're going to have to look at.
Justin Madders, what's your view on this? Because Keir Starmer so far has been fairly supportive of the government in terms of the economic measures that they've taken, but some big decisions are going to have to be made soon.
Well, they are, but I think it's probably too early, isn't it, to start talking about repayments, because actually we don't know when this is going to end, do we? We're talking hopefully about a vaccine within the next 6 months, but that's by no means guaranteed. Even if one did come forward, it will take a long time to roll out, and so there's going to be inevitably some pressure on the economy for a long time to come. I think we have to look at this in terms of what it is, which is a once in a generation event. Let's hope it is that, and we have to look at borrowing and repaying back the debt over that kind of time period. We are fortunate at the moment that the interest rates are low. It's easier for governments to borrow, although of course it is worth pointing out that we did come into this with significant amounts of government debt anyway, and the promise to balance the books by 2015, as George Osborne and David Cameron talked about, does seem a very, very long time ago, but there's no doubt at some point we will have to face that, and I think we need to make sure we're back on track before we get into that.
When the government's already spent upwards of £190 billion, there are lots of different sectors that say, well, look, given the continuing lockdowns in some areas, take the pubs industry for a start, they could legitimately say, well, look, we need a bit of a bailout. I mean, what's another £1 billion when you've already spent 190? And the temptation is for a government to say, well, look, we recognise that there's lots of problems. We are going to need to spend a lot more. But if you spend too much and lose the confidence of the money markets, that could be catastrophic as well.
Well, if there was an end in sight, if we knew what the strategy was, we could probably take a firmer view on that. But even if we don't support businesses that are having trouble at the moment, it's still going to cost the taxpayer money, because people will still need support anyway, be it through universal credit or other measures. And I think it's much wiser for us as a country in the long run to say, if there are businesses that are struggling at the moment that actually would be viable were it not for coronavirus, that we should be giving them that support now.
Don't forget the number to call, 0345 6060973, if you have a question for our panel. Mahyar Tousi, I'm not going to put words into your mouth, but I would imagine you would support the Thatcherite concept of sound money. Are we ever going to get that back, the whole idea that we can't spend more than we can afford?
I mean, you're absolutely right. The issue I have is that, firstly, I appreciate that politicians from both parties have to be very cautious and careful with wording and what they say. But when obviously Sarkar suggested that debt is always there, long-term debt, and basically it doesn't really matter short-term, and austerity is a bad word. I think that's the biggest problem. There's only one solution that we as humans, at least in the West, have discovered over the last century or so when it comes to these sort of problems. One is growth and creating wealth, and the other is austerity. I know austerity is a bad word, but it's because, again, in terms of language, it has become a bad word. It's not supposed to be. It's not supposed to be you're going to hit the poor and you're going to help the rich. Austerity simply means making sure that you have good bookkeeping when it comes to the Treasury and the government budget.
But it does austerity does hit the poor more than it does the rich, doesn't it? I mean, no one can deny that.
Well, it really depends what we mean by it, because you still have a situation where, for example, I'm not going to get into the details of what happened previously with the coalition. For example, the coalition government made a decision to cut the frontline pay and salaries, at the same time not making proper actual cuts overall. And that was a bad decision. I'm not even going to defend the coalition government, but as a concept, good bookkeeping, or as Margaret Thatcher said, good housekeeping is a good idea. But let's not focus too much on the austerity part of it, but in terms of wealth creation and in terms of growth, there's one system that we've created in the West over the few decades and century or so, which is free market capitalism, a market economy. If you want to get out of debt, and to be fair, the debt that we have in the West, all the countries in the West, is going to be difficult to actually pay off. We're not going to be able to pay it off anytime soon, but it's about being able to make it slightly better with the deficit and everything else. There's no other solution. You protect the frontline public services, the essential public services, at the same time, allow individuals and businesses to grow, to be able to actually create more revenue.
Karen in Putney, what's your response to what you've heard?
I'd like something a little bit more concrete, really. We've got a very huge debt to pay off, and I suppose what I'm thinking of is, for example, are you going to treat the debt for coronavirus like a war debt, for example? So you spread it over generations with a very long maturity, say 100 years. Or could we do something like put people on a 3-day week to help solve unemployment, reduce the salaries of top earners, become a tax haven, expand our best services worldwide, for example, revolutionise the education system to save money and make money by putting it online? We've got a fantastic system. So it's what services could we sell and how could we save money without going into the fringes, just being very direct about what we're going to do. Some
interesting ideas there. I think you should be working in the number 10 policy unit. Karen, Paul Scully, in terms of, Mahyar is right, isn't he? That part of the, if we're going to get out of this to any great degree, we've got to encourage more economic activity. Yeah. We've got to encourage lots of people to start up new businesses. Now, you're a business minister. I haven't seen many massive initiatives to encourage people to do that yet.
We saw in the last recession, a lot of people came out, and the entrepreneurial spirits, setting up their own businesses. And this time we've just reached our 75,000th small business loan from the British Business Bank. So everybody knows it now.
So they're existing businesses.
Yeah. Well, no, they're actually businesses that are being set up now as well. You can take it out in your first 3 years of starting a business. So there are people starting businesses now, but it's obviously a challenge because, as we've heard from other speakers, that we don't know where this is going at the moment. I've been talking to businesses to say, if you're planning, you've got to learn to live with the virus, because Justin talked about the vaccine. We are progressing really well with that, accelerating this too that are being researched in the UK, but there is no finite date when this is going to pop up. So if you're starting a business, if you're running a business, you've got to make sure that that you've got something to plan for. And people who have businesses are actually changing, they're pivoting as well. I want to make sure that pivot is the business word of next year at least, rather than furlough, because you're seeing some really good ideas and innovation coming out from some really young business people.
And Ash, what would you like to see the government do to encourage people to start new businesses? Because, we always think of entrepreneurialism as a thing of the right. It isn't actually. People all over the political spectrum start up businesses. Your own organisation, Novara Media, that's a small business, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very small business, but growing, we're getting there. One thing that I would really like to see the government doing is using local government contracting a lot more wisely. I think what we've seen in particular with the outsourcing of test and trace is that you've got, contracts worth billions and millions being given to these huge corporations which are actually quite bad at delivering services. And I'd like to see something more like the Preston model taken nationwide, because what the Preston model does is that it keeps money within the community. The council outsources services to local businesses, not huge behemoths like G4S or Sarkar and things of that nature. And it's been a real engine of regeneration for that community. So that's something I'd like to see in terms of the way in which the government can use its own procurement process in order to facilitate small businesses. The other thing in terms of job job creation was a really interesting report put out by the think tank Autonomy, which suggested that if the public sector implemented a 4-day working week, that it would lead to the creation of up to 500,000 new jobs concentrated in those crucial red wall seats, also in Wales, and it would also cost a fraction of Rishi Sunak's job retention bonus. So I think the time has come for really big ideas, not just to deal with the immediacy of the coronavirus crisis, but the fact that our economy has been sick for a really long time and not working for millions of people in this country.
Mar, you were nodding along to the Preston bit of what Ash said there, much to my surprise.
I'm going to say something interesting. It's quite rare, but I'm going to say partly I agree with what Ash said in terms of when her approach is to localise more. I absolutely agree, and we need more scrutiny when it comes to contracts and everything else, and local services. The two issues I have is firstly the 4-day week or anything like that. I understand that a lot of times with a modern economy that we have, even right now with the lockdown or semi-lockdown, a lot of people work from home. There's still a massive impact on other parts of the economy, whether it's high streets and other local shops that people don't really go to offices anymore. But I think the biggest problem that we have is that we don't really have a proper solution. I'm not just talking about the government, but any other party at this point, because we have obviously a lot of interventionist policies, we have a lot of good words, but we don't really have any direct policies that could actually help us, as I said earlier, grow the economy. And everything is all about the state is going to be helping you. But in reality, this is a method that we've been trying for years and years. Ash just said earlier that this is the economy that's been failing for some time. In fact, just before the coronavirus and the pandemic and everything else, the economy in this country over the last few years has been going really well. And then, we've brought down the deficit, we've been growing, the GDP has been growing, and jobs been obviously
fairly anemically, it has to be said. I mean, growth has not been at the levels that it has been over the last 20 or 30 years, although there has been growth. Justin, very quickly, because we need to go to a break. 4-day week. John McDonnell was a great fan of the 4-day week. Is that still Labour policy?
Well, it's not. It never was actually official policy, although it was something that we wanted to look at. And I think long term, we have to ask ourselves some serious questions about, with all the advances in AI and automation, whether continuing to work the level of hours that we do is a good idea. But I do actually agree with what's been said about the value of procurement. If, for example, we'd been procuring a lot more of our PPE from this country, perhaps we wouldn't have had the shortages that we'd seen early on in this pandemic. And
I think 70% of it is now procured from.
Yeah, and I hope that continues. And certainly from my constituency, we build lovely Astras, which I would love to see as a government vehicle. I'd love to see police forces and other public bodies procuring British-made vehicles like the Astra. I think there's an awful lot more we can do there. But the main thing that businesses
what do you drive?
I drive an Astra.
Thank goodness for that.
I wouldn't dare drive anything else. But I think the biggest thing business needs, especially new businesses, is certainty, and we don't have that at all at the moment.
Right, we will take more of your calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC's Cross Question with me, Iain Dale. It's 17 minutes past 8.
LBC Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:20 on LBC. You're listening to Cross Question with Paul Scully, Conservative Business Minister, Justin Madders, Shadow Health Minister, Ash Sarkar from Novara Media, and YouTuber Mahyar Tousi. Right, let's go to your next question. It's Ben in Wanstead. Ben, what's your question, please?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for having me. I wanted to ask the panel whether they believe that the 10 p.m. curfew is the right policy for dealing with the coronavirus crisis, considering the damage that it's causing to restaurants and pubs.
Justin Madders.
Well, that is indeed a very good question, one that Keir Starmer put to Boris Johnson today. I think it's important that we do see the evidence behind the government decision on this.
But you supported it without seeing the evidence.
Well, we support any measures that will restrict the transmission of the virus, but it's fair to say, I think, isn't it, that with the case numbers that we've seen in the last few weeks, that whatever measures have been coming in don't appear to be successful. So as it comes to Parliament next week, or possibly not, as there seems to be some suggestion that particular piece of legislation is actually going to be pulled, we want to see the basis upon which that decision has been made, because there's no doubt that.
But you didn't say that. With respect, you didn't say that at the time. I specifically remember Keir Starmer saying that he fully supported the measure coming in. There were no caveats about seeing the evidence at all. That's only come today. And then last night also, you abstained on a vote. I mean, how can you abstain on a vote on these sorts of issues?
Well, that was simply because we weren't opposing the government, and the only reason there was a vote was because the Conservative backbenchers wanted to cause a bit of trouble. I mean, the issue is the government come forward with proposals to limit transmission of the virus. Clearly, we're not going to be saying we don't support any efforts to limit the transmission of the virus, but what we don't always get is the evidence behind that. And when we see cases rising week on week, and in fact, the last 2 days we've seen the highest number of new coronavirus cases in the entire pandemic, it's right for us to be asking whether these measures are working. And when you hear stories about people being kicked out of the pubs at 10 and then just congregating en masse in the street, you've also got to ask whether the knock-on effect from this measure is actually causing more harm than good. So I think we do have to see the evidence. We do need to understand why this is considered to be a good measure to restrict transmission.
Paul Scully, what is the evidence for 10 o'clock?
Well, I've seen it from both sides. Because I'm the hospitality minister, effectively, so I speak to the pubs and restaurants all the time, pretty well weekly at the moment.
You're happy in your job at the moment?
I'm very happy in my job. It's a challenge, but it's a challenge I'm up for. But look, so the pubs are clearly talking about the issues that Justin was talking about the reduction in trade. I think about 30% down because of the change and the effect on second sittings in restaurants as well. So it's really important that we don't have this a day longer than we need to. A lot of the transmission seems to be coming from informal gatherings, from what I've seen around the country, and those kind of things. And so what the scientists appear to do, you've got the health experts, you've got the business experts, and you've got a lot of behavioural science in the middle that are trying to work out how to break up groups of people, whether it's the rule of six, whether it is the ending pubs early, closing pubs early, and whether it's not mixing in other scenarios, to make sure that we can keep the schools open. So it's getting that balance right, which is a tough balance, because we've seen how it is affecting the hospitality sector, and as I said, I see that day in, day out.
Now, the Scottish Government have announced some quite drastic new measures today. What do you make of those?
Well, I mean, the other thing is that virus does transmit there are local factors involved in that, so it is up to Scotland to make their own call. Clearly, not having an alcoholic drink and pubs closing at 6 is going to be quite a challenge for some people. I know it would be down here, and it's certainly going to be a massive effect on the hospitality sector.
But it's the sort of thing that presumably, and I mean, I don't know whether you're part of these discussions or not, but if you are responsible for the hospitality industry, you ought to be. Presumably, a similar thing could happen here, because there aren't many other measures that you can take.
Well, I think that actually that's the thing. I think because you talk about there are no other measures you can take. What the risk is that if you put in a whole suite of measures in one go, how do you disaggregate the information to see what's worked, what's not worked? In Northern Ireland, they have a different situation. It's the last orders at 10:30. They stop serving alcohol in entirety at 11, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. Northern Ireland is starting off with higher figures in terms of transmission. It'll be interesting to see what happens to those numbers.
But a decision is going to have to be made very, very quickly. I mean, I'm told that there might be an announcement tomorrow on some new measures, because the longer it goes on, the more infections there are going to be.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why we have to. I mean, because you've got some people that are saying, look, the transmission. I think Keir Starmer said himself, some of the figures are quite are relatively low in some areas, but they're still in local lockdown. A lot of people are complaining about that. So some people are saying go slower. Some people are saying go faster. Clearly, you need to try and be ahead of the curve if you can, because these are real people that are going to hospital, and some people, and people are dying, and they're all individuals.
Okay. Mahyar Tousi, do you think the 10 o'clock curfew is working? I think it's been in operation for 10 days. I'm not even sure how long you have to take to judge whether something is working or not.
Well, firstly, let me just say that in the first segment, I said I agree with Ash Sarkar. In this segment, I'm going to say, in terms of rhetoric, I agree with Keir Starmer in terms of the opposition to the 10 p.m. curfew. But to be serious, we know for a fact at this point that these decisions, especially the recent measures, whether it's the 10 p.m. curfew or the rule of 6, were actually political. And they came from the cabinet. And there were even government, obviously health experts, who were still quite skeptical towards the evidence about this. I'm not going to go completely radical and say, talk about Sweden or anything like that. But even in terms of the current situation in this country, we know, and you have mentioned it, Iain, yourself, the backlash, the counterproductiveness about this 10 p.m. curfew, that you actually get more people to go out because there are more people at 10 p.m. than at 2 a.m. When people leave the bars at 2 a.m., you might say they might be drunk, but there are few of them, and they use different methods to get home. It hasn't actually worked anyway. The issue we have is that there's absolutely no evidence for the science behind this. Even people like Sir Patrick Vallance has complained recently about the government actually not listening to them in terms of the scientific evidence on this. So it's interesting that I'm defending, obviously, previously Ash Sarkar, then Sir Keir Starmer, and now Sir Patrick Vallance on this.
Well, it'll be Justin Madder's next question that you agree with, presumably. Ash Sarkar, if you can be brief and we can squeeze in another question before the news.
I mean, I'll be as brief as I can, because I don't know which joker came up with this 10 p.m. curfew thing. Anyone who has worked in a pub, and I worked in pubs for about 7 years, can tell you that it's not after 10 p.m. that's your problem in terms of there being lots of people who want to be served, either crowded around the bar or crowded outside. It's immediately following work. And so by having a 10 p.m. curfew, you create an incentive for everyone to try and rush in, get the tables inside or crowding around outside in the smoking areas, and you're kind of encouraging people to binge drink. After 10 p.m. is when things calm down. So I don't think that this has been designed with, the real situation in hospitality, in the hospitality sector in mind. I think that this is the product of a government who is desperately trying to look like it's doing something and doesn't necessarily have particularly strong evidence behind it.
Is it okay if I add something quickly?
Yeah, go on.
Just a quick thing. Having said that, obviously I criticise the government at this point, but just a quick thing in terms of what Justin Madders said himself earlier, that he literally, I quote him, he said, "We support any measures." So Keir Starmer said the same. My issue is that, we could criticise the government at this point, but we need a good opposition. When you have an opposition party where they basically just say, we agree with anything the government does, and then when it doesn't work, they just criticise them, they blame everything on Boris Johnson, that's also a big problem.
Ben in Wanstead, you're not a fan of the 10 p.m. curfew, I gather.
No, definitely not. No, as an owner of a hospitality business, I really feel that, and a one at that, I really feel that it is limiting my ability to stay afloat. And I've done everything the government has asked me to do, from building pallet furniture right the way through to all the other measures that are required. And I would ask the business minister for some kind of reassurance that we're not going to go down this Scottish route. I note that the Scottish decision has been in line with the half-term in Scotland, and I fear and I am scared that our half-term unfortunately bridges the end of the furlough scheme, and should the government in 2 weeks' time decide to do something similar, then we would be very much as a sector left in the lurch. So I would ask him to give us some reassurances that wouldn't be the case. Obviously, everyone supports the reduction in transmission, and we're doing everything we can in that regard, but life has to continue.
Well, look, it's not me that makes the decisions, but I can guarantee that that I'll be pushing to keep the hospitality sector alive and
how does this work? When you're responsible for that sector, are there sort of cabinet committee meetings which you attend and you put in your two pennyworth?
Effectively,
this is going to happen.
Yeah, effectively, yes, because you've got the as I said before, you've got the behavioural science, but in the middle, and you've got the health and the economy either side of that. So you've got to get that balance right. But you've got in London, so covering in Wanstead, you've got Sadiq Khan that's been pushing for tougher measures, and we're trying to get that balance right so that we can have a break. 10 p.m, I think one of the other drives that the Prime Minister described it as when he first announced it was that it by having a hard close at 10 p.m, it was simple to understand. I take the point that Ash was saying about people working in pubs, but it is that sense that...
Can I ask them, Paul,
how easy
if you took behavioural science evidence, what did that say about closing the pubs at 10 o'clock?
Well, again, as I say, I wasn't part of that, but it is. You're looking because it's different from cities and rural areas. Clearly, it's going to be. It's going to have different effects.
Why weren't you part of it? Because this is the sector that's going to be affected. You're responsible for the hospitality sector. Why weren't you part of that decision-making process?
Well, I'm part of the discussion. But there's a lot of people involved in this. There's a lot. As I say, there's a lot of. You've got the science. You've got the behavioural scientists as well, and it's getting that match right. So
you can't tell us what they said.
So it's getting the balance right, and as I say, it's one part of a suite of measures, which does make it difficult to disaggregate, but it's one part of a suite of measures to separate people.
I was talking earlier to Emma McClarkin from the Beer and Pubs Association. She says that she would like to hear a lot more from the government, that she doesn't feel that they're being consulted enough. I don't think they're certainly not getting any prior notice of any decisions. Why aren't you talking more to people like her?
Emma I speak to on a weekly basis, and actually all of the guidance that we did when we were reopening the pubs in the first place was all based on conversations that we had in some detail with people like Emma that are representing our members as the British Beer and Pub Association, with pubs and pub owners and restaurant owners. We were looking down to the detail of what happens with air conditioning and things like that, the real minutiae that you have to do about transmission. So some of these decisions that we're making now, this is government working
so she's being unreasonable.
Well, no. I mean, government is working in about as real time as you're ever going to get government. For those of us that run businesses before, when we're having to make decisions, government tends to work on 6-month consultations, 12-month consultations. We're working, day to day at the moment because we're having to respond quickly.
More of your questions in a moment on a multitude of subjects on Cross Question. It's 8:32 News Headlines with Serena Farrow.
There'll be no alcohol sold in pubs or restaurants across 5 areas of Scotland for more than 2 weeks starting Friday. They can only serve takeaways. Stricter coronavirus measures announced by the First Minister mean across the rest of the country all licensed premises can only serve outdoors. Ministers are going to look at reducing the time that travellers have to self-isolate when returning to the UK. A task force is being set up to review testing options and will report back to the Prime Minister. And around 900 jobs are going at Manchester, East Midlands and London Stansted airports. Security officers, engineers and car park attendants are all being affected. LBC weather: rain in the southwest spreading east. Heavy downpours though in Wales, Northern Ireland, southern Scotland and the north of England, with a low of 6 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:35 is the time. If you just tuned into Cross Question, we have with us Ash Sarkar from Novara Media, YouTuber Mahyar, Tousi, Paul Scully, who is a business minister, and Justin Madders, who is a shadow health minister. Let's go to your next question. It's David in Bracknell. David, what would you like to ask?
Yeah, hello Ian. My question to the panel is, who should be held accountable for the £8 billion of public money spent on an ineffective test and trace system?
Thought it was 11 billion. Mahyar, Tousi.
Is it 11? I didn't know that. Oh, okay.
I thought it was 12.
Higher. Mahyar, how would you answer that?
Obviously, on the surface, you would always go with the government because they are responsible. I fully understand that. But this is a system we've created over the last few decades, actually, where you got the bureaucratic side of government most of the time not really accountable. When you have a situation where test and trace as a project hasn't worked, where you have a situation where HS2 isn't working, and you can name a lot of other projects where institutionally they don't really work. And yes, you could always blame the politicians and obviously the government. They are responsible. But at the end of the day, you could fire a minister. You could replace him with someone else. If you don't address the real deep problem of the system, it doesn't really help. And I fully understand that, for example, with test and trace and all the recent decisions, I appreciate that ministers in government and the Prime Minister have had a tough time because they had to make decisions quite urgently with everything else. They've been in a rush. But at the end of the day, they have to be responsible, and I don't think that it's been easy for them. Test and trace should completely be scrutinized as a project, and when the government, unfortunately, all I'm going to say is that they are the victim of the monster that they've created. They were very successful initially to obviously scare people enough to go into the lockdown. And now, since then, they've been run by the media and obviously the likes of Piers Morgan, who basically have been pushing for certain things. And every decision has been political, not scientific.
That's a bit of a gross generalisation to say that every decision has been political. They're presumably taking advice from the scientific community and then making a decision. Sometimes they may agree with the scientists, sometimes they may not.
Of course, no, I agree. It has certain decisions you could say that a lot of them were suggested by Sage.
Yeah, but you said every decision.
But yes, but I do believe that at the end of the day, the decisions that were made, obviously the suggestions that they received from their own scientific advisors and obviously medical officers, at the end of the day, the way it looks, obviously I'm not inside the government, and I do understand that ministers and the Prime Minister have great intentions. They want to take care of the country. The way it looks from the outside is that they received the suggestions, but they're still political.
Justin Madders, this is a difficult one for any government, isn't it? Because you have to make political decisions and essentially say to this system, right, we want you to do this. And then when this goes wrong, the minister will hold up the hand and say, well, it's not my fault that they used an Excel spreadsheet when they shouldn't have done. I can't be held responsible for that. Who is responsible for this?
Well, clearly the government at the end of the day have to take responsibility. The Prime Minister, the Health Secretary, they are the ones who have to answer for what's gone on. And of course there will be individual problems, but I think the issue with the spreadsheet, for example, is probably a symptom of the fact that Public Health England have had their budget cut by 5% every year for the last 5 years, and they're not going to be in a position to invest in new software. But there are, I think, big questions about some of the calls that have been made by government in this. I think the fact that we had to completely change course on the app at an early stage. If you remember back in May, that we're going down one particular route. I think most people in the world were going down another route, and in the end, government decided actually the route the rest of the world was going down was probably the better one, because the one they had designed from scratch wasn't going to work. That's something I think someone has to be accountable for, and I suspect it's probably Matt Hancock. In terms of the test and trace, as I've been on many times with you Ian before, I think the decision to go on an outsourcing model at the start was the wrong one. There should have been an attempt to build up existing NHS capacity.
But there wasn't the capacity, that was the point.
Yes,
the only thing that they could do was to build it outside, surely.
Well, they could have started working with the people who had the experience in test and trace, which is the local public health bodies, who have actually got a good track record. And if you look at the figures in terms of how contact tracing has been working since the pandemic started, you will see that local public health bodies are far more successful than the likes of Sarkar, and that's really a lot about the discussions that we've been having tonight about pubs and so on, is because we haven't got an effective test and trace system. So it all comes back to those decisions taken in the early days to go down a particular route, and we're still paying the price for that now.
Paul Scully, accountability is really important in politics, in government. Do you accept that a Secretary of State in whichever department is ultimately responsible for everything that happens within the purview of that department, even if it is somebody sending a Microsoft Excel file that is too big to be sent? I mean, have we got down to that point where a Secretary of State has to accept ministerial responsibility for that?
Yeah, we have to accept ministerial responsibility, but clearly, like a chief executive of a company would take the responsibility for what happens within that company. What we then do as a result is how we fix it afterwards that is key. So have we been asking the right questions? If it's how do we fix this Excel spreadsheet situation so that it doesn't happen again? These are key things that we need to then work on. But we've built a test and trace system, as Mahyar said, from scratch. We've been doing all of these things from scratch. We're not going to get everything perfectly right, and it's really important that we do fix them quickly, because as we said earlier, it will affect the rate of infection spreading and clearly then people's lives and people's livelihoods, as we've discussed. But what we have seen with the test and trace system is that the capacity continues to increase, and we've got people socially isolating as a result of the test and trace system, so that we can stop that transmission, and yet other people can actually go about their lives in some way, shape or form of normality.
Ash?
I mean, I think that there are a series of both structural and individual failures which have gotten us to the mess that we're in. In terms of the structural failures, I'd like to echo the points that have been made about the outsourcing model. I think what's happened over the last few decades is that vast sums of public money have gone towards, these huge corporations, which are very, very good at winning, contracts from national and local governments, and less good at delivering services. And we've seen that time and time again with Carillion, with G4S, with Deloitte and Sarkar running bits of test and trace. You've got the other bit, which is the unique dysfunction at Public Health England, which is the result of, chronic underfunding. And then on the other hand, it was sort of built to be a bit rubbish. It is, the demonic offspring of those 2011 healthcare reforms. And then the third thing, which I think hasn't been mentioned and I think really ought to be, is that the cronyism of the staffing decisions of who's been put in charge of what, I think is really outrageous. Dido Harding, who presided over a huge data breach at TalkTalk, hundreds of thousands of customers' personal details being stolen, being put in charge of a contact tracing app is laughable. In the famous words of Jose Mourinho, she's a specialist in failure. Why has she been put in charge of such a crucial part of our public health response? Right. I've got no idea.
Paul Scully, just answer
that comes back to exactly what we're saying. So she was a chief exec of a company. What, did she press the button and release all the contacts?
No, that was a pretty serious breach.
No, of course it was. No, of course it was. But what I'm saying is that's why she took responsibility for that, which happened within the corporation. And then did she fix it? How did that work? And to make sure that it could never happen again. But what we heard from Ash earlier on was a sensible suggestion about getting smaller companies involved in procurement, local government procurement and stuff like that. And yet she's actually then saying on something like this, she wants government to build a test and trace system. And frankly, as I say, I'm tend to be someone that looks at people for their expertise, and government are not particularly good at building big systems.
We've got 15 more minutes for more of your questions. 0345 6060 973. You can text your questions also to 84850. It's 8:45.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast, LBC.
The Church of England putting its own reputation above protecting children from sexual abuse, a damning report has discovered. Mark in Leeds, how does this affect you?
I'm the victim of child abuse through a religious organisation. We was advised not to go to the police because it would affect our standing in the organisation.
How do you feel towards the man who abused you?
He destroyed my life. He destroyed my childhood. I hate him.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast, weekday mornings from 7, LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:48. When I trailed the programme earlier, I described Ash Sarkar as a left-wing commentator and Mahyar Tousi as a right-wing commentator. I don't know if that's provoked Nick in Kings Lynn to send this text in. He says, is there any relevance these days as labelling MPs as left-wing or right-wing? Is there any relevance of having political parties whatsoever? And should we just admit the UK is a one-party state? I'm going to keep answers on this very brief because I want to fit at least one more question in. Paul Scully, let's come to you. How do you self-describe?
Yeah, it's not quite as easy as left and right. I think I'm sort of right-wing economically, free market, but I'm socially liberal, so it's slightly more complicated than that. But yeah, there is still a left-wing and a right-wing, but clearly people clump in the centre. It's like the traditional bell curve. So most of the British public are somewhere in the centre, just maybe a touch one side or the other.
Ash, I don't think you object to being called left-wing, but are left-wing and right-wing terms really as relevant as maybe they were 30 or 40 years ago?
I think they're still meaningful, but you've got to attach other bits to it. I think libertarian and authoritarian are meaningful terms that you add onto it. It can tell you something about someone's worldview and their disposition. But I think the more honest we are about what our politics are, the easier we can have an honest conversation. So that's why I think this kind of labelling is quite useful.
I'm not sure Jeremy Corbyn would have been in the centre in the one-party state that he's talking about. Really.
He's a social democrat. Come on.
Oh my goodness. Mahyar, you've been a bit of a lefty tonight.
Well, okay, firstly, just because I agree with Ash and Keir Starmer doesn't mean...
I'm sorry.
To clarify, I think that comment that came to you guys, I think that basically means that both main parties are now essentially interventionists and essentially left-wing. That's the situation we have. But I agree with, obviously, Paul Scully. I'm similar to him, obviously free market, but also socially liberal. And, I criticise the government tonight a lot, but at the same time, firstly, the Labour Party don't have any alternative, but also I know that Paul and other ministers are working really hard. But overall, the main two parties, there are more similarities than differences.
Justin, I have no clue which part of the Labour Party you belong to. Are you? Dare I ask you if you're a Blairite, Corbynist?
I'm neither of those things. I prefer to call myself a Labour Party member, and I think.
How boring.
Well, honestly, I do think we spend an awful lot of time trying to pick out small differences between ourselves and the Labour Party, and really we've got to think about the values that we all share, the things that are really important to us, which are creating a more fair, a more just and a more equal society, and that's what gets me up in the morning. And if that means I'm left-wing, I'm happy to take that description.
Well, at least Gordon Brown used to get up because of the Arctic monkeys. that was at least interesting. Right, let's go to Simon in Southampton. Simon, hi, what would you like to say?
Yeah, good evening. Just as an aside to my question, it bemuses me that people on the right throw the accusation of being left as an insult. If you ask me about left wing and right wing, in my opinion, there's only left wing and wrong wing. But there we go. So my question is, who should win the US election? And do you think that Trump's episode of COVID will affect the outcome?
Justin.
Well, I'm sure it won't come as a surprise that I don't want Donald Trump to win.
Sure. That's the news.
That is
in this program.
Hold the front page on that one. Will his COVID experience affect the outcome? I suspect not, actually, because if you look at his current poll ratings and his record over the last 4 years, it's been pretty dreadful. It's been pretty divisive. I think people are sick of the way he does politics, the way he is really mismanaging the country, and that's been exemplified really by his handling of the coronavirus. So I think the sooner we get rid of him, the better.
Mahyar.
Well, that's a very obviously black and white version of this, because firstly, I'm glad that I'm British, not American, because at this point I don't know which side I would usually pick, because both sides are quite problematic. And also, including Donald Trump himself, I disagree with the rhetoric at all times. I still agree with that the America and the West in general needed a bit of a shake-up, especially post-2016 and of Hillary Clinton as an option, and now. I still agree with a number of policies that Donald Trump has obviously done and implemented in terms of growth and jobs and a number of other things. But at the same time, I think the situation is, if he's going to be winning or not, as a Brit, considering what obviously Biden has said about Brexit and the EU, I'd rather have President Trump to negotiate a relationship with the UK. That's one thing. But in terms of the other part of the question was about COVID and Donald Trump. People are quite divided on this. Some people say that he's going to come across as a victim, so he's going to get the sympathy vote. Some people say he's going to come across as weak, because that's always been his biggest thing, that he doesn't want to be kind of seen as weak. He wants to be the winner. I really can't predict what's going to happen. It's going to be very close, but again, as a Brit, in terms of being biased, I prefer Trump. But in terms of politically, I don't always agree with his rhetoric or language or the way he does things. I could agree with some policies, I could disagree with other policies.
Okay, Ash.
So Trump has got a huge problem in the polls at the moment, and he did have a problem in the polls in 2016. Lots of people are saying, well, what would make this so different now? But his deficit, particularly amongst women, is growing. You've also got the fact that after his bouts with coronavirus, 65% of people polled think that he brought it on himself with his cavalier and reckless attitude to social distancing and wearing masks. You've got the mismanagement of the pandemic, which has cost over 200,000 American lives. You've got a growing unemployment crisis. So all those things don't look good for him. What I would say is that what he's doing, I think quite deliberately, is planting the seeds of doubt, of trying to get people to mistrust the election result by peddling these conspiracy theories about mail-in ballots. And what he's hoping is that if he can achieve a close enough result, it will go to the Supreme Court, and he's more confident of getting a decent result in the Supreme Court. So the one thing that would really turn it against him is high turnout.
Paul Scully.
Well, to be fair, neither of the candidates are particularly appealing to me. I think 3 million people watched me calling Donald Trump something of an idiot about 4 years ago in a petitions committee debate in the States. I was surprised when
I'd done my research, I would have known that.
I was surprised when the US actually gave me a visa to travel to New York a couple of years ago. But
have you changed your opinion since then?
Well, as I say, neither of the candidates are appealing. Should I put it like that? I think I was surprised that they picked. They found Hillary Clinton last time was probably the only person that was going to lose to Donald Trump at the last election.
So, if you had a vote, who would you vote for?
I don't. Well, it's a tough one, because look, I mean, at the end of the day, whatever the result of the election, he is still the president of the United States, and we've really got to, as rude as I can be about the individual or the individuals, we've still got to make sure that we work with the person that's the incumbent, because we've still got a trade deal to do. We've still got a lot of security collaboration and other collaboration that
he would be an easier person to deal with on a trade deal.
In many ways, he would. Yeah, in many ways, he would actually. Because we keep hearing the threat from some of the lobbies in Nancy Pelosi, for example, about the risk of a trade deal should certain conditions happen. Whereas Donald Trump wants to do a deal. We are not going to do a deal under just any particular circumstances. So otherwise, we get to the same debate that we always do.
I thought you were going to say, as a government minister, obviously I can't offer an opinion in a foreign election, but you didn't.
No.
Credit to you for that. Simon, I'm going to take it that you would not be supporting Donald Trump, given what you said in the early part of your question. So let's move. Simon, I'm going to leave that because we've only got a few minutes left, and I want to go to David in Enfield for our final question. David, what would you like to ask?
Good evening. What's the biggest recent mistake made by this government?
Well, Ash.
I think the biggest recent mistake is not getting Test, Trace and Isolate set up robustly before reopening the economy. Like anyone, I want to get back to normality. I want to socialise. I want to see my family. I want to do all those things safely. And that should have been the condition under which things open up, rather than letting the horse out first and then going, oh, what should we do about the stable door?
Mahyar.
So, was the question the biggest mistake?
What's the biggest recent mistake by this government?
Listening to the mainstream media and allowing the media to create and shift the narrative in terms of everything that's been happening economically, but also the pandemic in general. I have a feeling that a lot of people in government could have made different decisions on the basis of whether it was science or economics.
Who in the mainstream media has the power to shift government policy?
So I don't agree with any sort of conspiracy theories. It's not like they had a meeting one day and said let's go with this. It's just a mentality that this country has had with the media, essentially going with the fear that they created. I'm not saying that you shouldn't take this situation seriously. All I'm saying that the biggest mistake overall has been that Boris Johnson has always been seen as a strong, independent character, as a leader. I'm going to do what I want and what I believe. And over the last 6 months, it doesn't look like that he is. It seems like everything that the mainstream media have been pushing, the government have been following.
Yeah, but sorry, who are these people in the so-called mainstream media? What have they been pushing, and who are they?
I mean, from the likes of obviously Piers Morgan to your.
Well, they don't put ministers up on Piers Morgan's programme, so I don't imagine they're listening to him very much.
Of course not, but I do have a feeling that this government, just like the Blair government, are run by opinion polls and focus groups and the media. So the fact that right now in the opinion polls, still about 70% are still pro lockdown measures because of the fear that the media and the government have created over the last 6 months. The cabinet automatically will think that...
Ash, you're not looking very impressed by this. In fact, you're turning up your nose at Mahyar.
Yeah, I just think it's a bit crackers, mate. I'm sorry. I just don't think that's what's going on.
This is what we want. Justin.
Well, we haven't got long, have we?
No, we haven't. I'm afraid.
So many things I could choose.
No, just one.
Just one. Okay, well, they didn't fix test and trace when the sun was shining. That's the biggest mistake, and that's why we're in this mess now.
Paul, are you going to admit to a big mistake that the government's made recently?
Probably the last time they didn't listen to me, I don't know. But no, I think actually, just to pick up something that Mark... in terms of an answer. No, it is in terms of an answer, because actually it was probably actually feeding the likes of Piers Morgan's ego, because by going on the programme in the first place, because actually
interviewers have no ego at all.
When he was talking about media coverage, it's a really complicated media message that we're trying to get out in terms of, originally it was all about not swamping the NHS and making sure that we could protect the NHS to save lives, which then translated quite quickly into people...
He's stalling for time. He's not going to say what the mistake is. Come on, tell us what the mistake is.
So it is actually, as I say, allowing people like Piers to actually to focus in on certain areas rather than actually...
So the government should be putting ministers up on Good Morning Britain. That's what you're saying.
Well, no, because as I say, you're feeding that, and he's banned us anyway. But I mean, the point is...
No, he hasn't banned you. He would like a government minister to appear, just as I would like more government ministers to appear. Thank you.
So the point is about getting a clear message out, which we're trying to do, but we sometimes have to circumvent people who want to run their own agenda.
Okay, I'm not quite sure we got a mistake there, but anyway...
My job here is done then.
Margaret in Huddersfield says, Rishi Sunak has urged people that lose their jobs to retrain. What would you retrain as if you had to? Just a one-word answer will do, please. Justin?
Be a tester.
Be a tester. Paul?
Yeah, no, I've no idea what I'd retrain as, but one of my retirement instrument, I want to learn to play the sitar. There you go.
Why?
I've no idea, just always fancied it.
Okay. Mahyar?
There you go.
Football manager.
Oh, excellent.
Why not?
And Ash?
Burglar. It was the first job I ever wanted as a kid.
There's no answer to that, really, is there? And with that brings us to the end of this week's Cross Question. Next week, I'll be joined by Kirsten Oswald, the Deputy Westminster Leader of the SNP, Labour MP Richard Bergen, and Conservative MP Andrea Leadsom, and a fourth yet-to-be-identified panellist. If you've missed any of this episode, you can catch it up on the Cross Question podcast. Coming up in a moment, we have the LBC Business Hour. Emma Jones is going to be joining me in the studio. We're going to be looking at how young people, in particular, can set up new businesses. You're listening to LBC. It's 9:01.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, extra measures are being taken to bring down the level of coronavirus infections across Scotland. New restrictions come in for hospitality businesses from Friday for 16 days. Pubs and restaurants will only be allowed to serve food indoors until 6 o'clock at night, but outdoor bars can serve alcohol until